Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 30th of March 2024. Let's get straight to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to the video below. 730 personnel lost is not the biggest number we've seen in the range of lost personnel over the course of the war. Recently, last sort of 3 or 4 days, that's been part of the course, but it's not up to over the 1,000 mark. But still significant, right? 29 tanks is a phenomenal number. That is a huge number of tanks that the Ukrainians have taken out for the Russians, and that's going to have a massive effect. Even if you take a third of that off, that's still 20 odd tanks, so pretty staggering number there. 20 armoured personnel vehicles and 15 artillery systems. Still marginally above average for artillery systems, is actually pretty much spot on average there, maybe a little bit below. 20 APVs is above average, but not the biggest number, but still really significant. To lose 20 IFVs or armoured personnel vehicles in a day is pretty catastrophic in my books. One anti-aircraft warfare system and 25 vehicles and fuel tanks, not the highest number in that category, 7 pieces of special equipment. But 29 tanks, wow, it's pretty incredible. Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, he talked about, for a couple of minutes, around a 38 minute mark, he talks about how if you compare Russian attacks now to not, say, 2 months ago, but sort of 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago, you can see a massive difference to the way they are using vehicles that has shown that things have changed. So now you're seeing the Russians attack with sort of 3 or 4 APVs, maybe a tank, doing their attacks, getting repelled, having possibly all of those vehicles or some of those vehicles get destroyed. But whereas a year and a half ago, you would see attacks involving 30 vehicles, 20 vehicles, where, you'd have a bit of a catastrophe and 12 vehicles would then suddenly shoot off, get out of dodge. And just the sheer scale of the attacks with mechanized equipment back then compared to now tells you something, I think, really significant in terms of, have the Russians lost an awful lot of vehicles and equipment? Yes, they have. Are these figures at least somewhat correct in the ballpark? Yes, I think they are. And this is then backed up by this sort of lost data, confirmed lost data that we see on a daily basis. Now, if we look at yesterday's lost stats from Andrew Perpetua, and of course, as he showed recently, he got some high-res satellite imagery and he found an extra 50%. So they'd found out 96 vehicles blown up near Terney or abandoned, damaged. And something like 13% of them, around 13.5% of them around there had been recovered. But then with that high-res imagery, they found another 50. So another 50% onto that. So they're only finding 2/3 of the vehicles. If you're just going to take that and extrapolate that across the front line, then at any point in time, there's another 50% to add on to the stat to the Russian losses. I can't speak for the Ukrainian losses, but certainly it appears that way for the Russian losses. Right, let's look at these stats. We are looking at a sort of 3-to-1 loss ratio, 2.5, 3-to-1, which is pretty good for the Ukrainians. Obviously, it's better if it were more. You can take off that decoy down there. We have a couple of boats, M777, a couple of tanks, BMP, M113, and then pickup trucks and SUVs. So nothing too high value there. For the Russians, we have some pretty high value bits of kit. So the Tor M1 and the Tor M2, those are the tracking radars. Well, certainly one of them is a tracking radar. That's the best part of $30 million. That's really high value stuff. And you add the Strela 10 short range air defense system, and that's pretty meaningful. A whole bunch of surveillance and comms equipment, some tanks there, 3 tanks, a number of infantry fighting vehicles, not as many as we have seen previously, quite a few APCs, and then down to trucks, ATVs, and civilian vehicles. So just a whole mass of stuff. But those top 3 articles there are really expensive, and that's high value equipment. Again, Andrew Perpetua was talking about how there seems to be a bit of a project at the moment from the Ukrainians to try and hit air defense systems. That is something that they appear to be, unless it's just sheer joss with the statistics, but it appears that they are trying to do that. In Krinky, some new data sets have come out to show that the losses are still pretty staggering for the Russians. They've lost 242 vehicle equipment losses, and the Ukrainians 53. So that is a fifth, 5-to-1 ratio. That is pretty incredible there. I don't know at the moment how many pieces of equipment are being destroyed in the Krinky area, whether the Ukrainians are still able to exact that cost on the Russians. It's been a long time. It's a very, I guess, mature frontline area now, where both sides will have settled into a kind of a routine. And I don't know if the Russians have learned from their massive losses so as not to consistently throw equipment into that area to see it get destroyed. And then if it gets to a point where the Russians aren't losing that much stuff, then what is the point of the Ukrainians being there? Is it sacrificial or not? I don't. I'm speculating. I have no idea what the present statistical evaluation is there. Now, moving on to the definite death stats for Russian soldiers, and I don't think this includes DPR or LPR. I'm not sure about Wagner. I keep saying it every time that I talk about these stats. So you can throw on a bunch more to this as minimums, and also you can be assured that this is the absolute benchmark minimum. So what is this? This is the work between BBC Russia and Mediazona, where they are scouring the internet and the socials to find out obituaries, funerals of people that they know have been killed in the war, and they have quite high criteria for this, so that even if they're pretty sure, they think someone would have been in the war and has died, and they've been announced to have been killed, or they're announced to be dead, if it doesn't specifically say that they died in the war, then they won't include it. So this is a real sort of benchmark minimum. 49,000 now, 49,281. So any stats that the Russians give you, if it's less than 49,281, and then add on the DPR, LPR, and possibly Wagner as well, but I'm not sure about Wagner, then the Russians are talking nonsense. So since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, at least 49,281 military personnel have died in the war. Their names were verified from open sources by journalists of BBC Russian service and Mediazona, together with volunteers. The journalists confirmed the deaths of more than 3,300 officers of the Russian army and other law enforcement agencies. 386 of them were in the rank of lieutenant colonel and higher. Yeah, pretty staggering numbers. Of course, when you look at the general staff figures of 441,520, we now know general staff includes injured in that. So that's wounded and killed in action, heavily wounded so as not to be able to take part in the war, at least in the immediate future. Of course, there's going to be a lot of guesstimation with those figures, much more than the equipment, as I said before. When you are trying to work out how many people have died when you're striking a building, or even a vehicle, you don't know how many people are inside the vehicle, and it gets fundamentally disassembled. You're guessing, well, was it a full vehicle? Was it an empty vehicle? Do we take an average? So on and so forth. So there's going to be an awful lot of guesstimation with these numbers of personnel, but not with the vehicles. With the vehicles, you see the vehicle, it gets blown up or damaged in a way that it means it won't be able to be driven again. So you count that, and it's pretty verified. Troops not so much so, but nonetheless, 49,000. When you compare to the troops lost in the much longer Afghanistan conflict, you know that this is a very bad conflict for the Russians. So moving on to the Su-27SM that was shot by friendly fire. It's pretty much been confirmed to be friendly fire now. Russian Telegram channels shared more details about the Russian aircraft that crashed yesterday in Crimea. Reportedly, it's a Su-27 shot down by a Russian Pantsir anti-aircraft missile gun system. For some unknown reason, the air defense did not receive notification of the departure of their Su-27. Because the Pantsir system's combat crew did not receive a response from the Su-27 pilot to its interrogation, the decision was made to fire the plane for effect. As it became known later, the system's crew interrogation did not reach the Su-27 pilot because the IFF interrogator on the Pantsir system was not working correctly. Some Russian media call this a technical deficiency. So that's obviously a shame if you are that Russian pilot. And indeed, the pilot did eject, and there was a parachute scene coming down. But I was listening to the conversation on Andrew Perpetua's live stream about that, and I think it's understood that pilot still didn't make it. So even if you do eject from a plane, it's very dangerous ejecting when you have a plane going that speed and then you fly up, and then think of the pressures on you, and as the speed and the change of sort of direction and everything from you ejecting. So I don't think that pilot survived, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then go into those two Tor SAM battery elements of the system. This is in Kharkiv Oblast. Ukrainian FPV munitions destroy half of a Russian Tor SAM battery in a single short engagement, hitting a pair of Telars. Those are erector launchers, transport erector launchers. So, and radar. So they are expensive bits of kit that have been taken out with very cheap drones. $400 drones takes out, a couple of $400 drones take out $30 million worth of equipment. That is an asymmetry that is very painful. And of course, that happens with both sides. Lancet's particularly causing a lot of havoc to the Ukrainian equipment further back behind the line. Right. Moving on to distance munitions, standoff munitions. The Air Force shot down 9 out of 12 Shaheeds last night. I don't have any detail of any drones that got through last night particularly, so it's a relatively quiet night compared to what we have seen. Just going back to some of the previous hits. So yesterday morning, Russia attacked the Kremenchuk hydroelectric power plant with 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles launched from Crimea. The first one struck the generator at the dam. The second one struck the substation transmission lines. They are causing problems to the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and it is a problem. This is definitely a problem. Initial reports from the strike indicate that the Kremenchuk hydroelectric power plant was hit by those 2 Iskanders. These reports are further confirmed with geolocated footage of both missiles striking the hydroelectric power plant. Not good news there. My hometown, says this source, Kamyanska, after tonight's shelling with drones and ballistic missiles. So Kamyanska was absolutely hammered. There are children among the victims. It's a shame not to help a country that is fighting for shared values, fighting against an effing terrorist, provide Ukraine with air defense. And, some of the imagery that comes out of this destruction is horrific. It's just, yeah. And then when you hear people like David Sachs sounding off against Ukraine online, like some, I don't know, spoiled, privileged knob jockey, you just think, and then, having his voice amplified by both Twitter and Elon Musk personally, you're thinking how unfair it is. This is obvious. The moral evaluation to me is so obvious, and you are amplifying against that obvious moral evaluation. It's just, I hate it when life is unfair. Zmivska thermal power plant was completely destroyed near Kharkiv. Now it's become apparent as a result of the Russian missile attack back on March the 22nd. So when they had that huge attack, all units were destroyed and auxiliary equipment was damaged. I mean, that's one of the biggest. It's a huge power plant, and it is by all accounts completely taken out. I mean, that is phenomenally problematic for the Ukrainians. They were celebrating recently that they were actually exporting energy to the continent, to Europe. They got themselves back into a really decent position with regard to their energy infrastructure and production. That's certainly not going to be the case now. Goodness me. Now, the Washington Post has asked Zelensky about the Financial Times report. So I want to rewind a bit. What happened? Because actually we seem to be swinging back to the US genuinely being against Ukraine attacking Russian oil refineries. So sometime back, the Financial Times came out with an article that said the US has had a right go at Ukraine for hitting oil refineries. It's not in their economic interest, as in the US's economic interest, and you could argue the wider West's economic interest, that all these oil refineries get hit, because then global supply gets affected, and that pushes up the cost of energy, which means that then countries have to deal with an energy crisis, or an energy problem at least, and that drives up inflation. And then you have to politically deal with that, and it costs everyone. And if people then say, go to the gas pump and say, well, this has cost me an extra however much, this is Ukraine's fault, then actually there is an argument that it does Ukraine some damage with public opinion outside of Ukraine. So the US apparently had a go at Ukraine. Then there was lots of talk, and people like Jake Bro and myself, I was talking about this, how actually this wasn't that the US was having a go. This was US doing a bit of realpolitik and announcing to Russia, really, that we don't support these attacks. It doesn't mean we're against them. We're not encouraging them. We're not supporting them because that's what Russia wants us to hear. But actually, secretly, we are in support of Ukraine doing that. Now we're back to a position where actually, no, the US weren't happy with it, and we can derive this from what Zelensky himself has said. So Zelensky confirmed, well, quote, the reaction of the US was not positive on this, he confirmed, but Washington couldn't limit Ukraine's deployment of its home-built weapons. Quote, we used our drones, nobody can say to us you can't. So this is like, the US weren't happy with us blowing up drones, but there are, blowing up oil refineries, but there are drones and we can do what we like with them. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Zelensky argued that he could check Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy grid only by making Russia pay a similar price. In other words, we can only stop them attacking our energy grid if we attack theirs. If there's no air defense to protect our energy system and Russians attack it, my question is, why can't we answer them? Their society has to learn to live with petrol, without diesel, without electricity. It's fair. And of course, that applies to American and Western societies too, right? This obviously changes things back. So we make our conclusions based on the data we have at hand, and absent data like this, we go, oh, maybe the US were just sort of signaling to Russia. No, it appears that they genuinely were not happy with Ukraine doing that, and Ukraine has said, sod you. And I think Zelensky is now at the point where he's starting to vocalize his discontent with the impasse in Congress. We'll come to that a little bit later, but he's saying things that are much more explicit because he's desperate. Things are, challenging in Ukraine. Of course they are. Russians have used an ODAB 1,500 heavy aerial bomb for the first time in Sumy Oblast, according to De Bild. It's thermobaric projectile from the USSR, which releases a flammable liquid in the form of an aerosol and sets it on fire approximately 10 meters before hitting a target. And it looks something like this. It's a really significant munition here, bit of ordnance. So that has been used in Sumy Oblast. And this is what Ukraine are having to deal with on a daily basis. They need air defenses, not just against the Russian projectiles thrown into Ukraine, but against the airframes as well. Right. Zelensky shakes up his presidential office, so moving on to other bits and pieces, with more dismissals. He's moved people around. He's got rid of people, apparently dismissed 2 more members of the presidential office and 4 advisors in a continuing reshuffle of his inner circle. There are different ways of interpreting this. One is things are desperate, you've got to change things up. 2 is these people aren't very good, you need to move them on. 3 is these people aren't as supportive of his views and he needs to move them on, and there's maybe a bit of dissent in the ranks. 4 is actually when you are over 2 years into a war, people need to be moved on. You see, like, NATO generals get moved on every 2 or 3 years. Not moved on, but like rotated, and things happen. You want fresh ideas in. You have cabinet reshuffles in governments all the time. Dynamics change. So it could be a combination of all those things, right? I have absolutely no idea. But what I will say is that it would be unusual if you kept everyone in place during the completely stressful times of a war in the way that Ukraine is suffering. Right? To think that everyone would just be awesome the whole time and they're going to be functioning, without hitting exhaustion or without, struggling at certain times or without suddenly, not getting on with each other. These are going to be times of immense stress. So you're going to have arguments, you're going to have issues. So I don't know that we should say that this is, we should be worried about stuff like this. We should expect stuff like this. Is it worrying? I don't know. People move on. I mean, you should see what's going on with the UK cabinet at the moment. We're not in war. And Rishi Sunak's just lost another couple. James Heapy, one of the secretary ministers, who's really decent, actually, has gone. I mean, our government's in all sorts of trouble at the moment. And we ain't at war. So, Chris, although technically I think we kind of are. Chris Owicki here, giving a thread on how Russian military personnel are reportedly paying bribes to be posted to Syria rather than Ukraine as casualties mount a special military operation. Syria now appears to be seen as a much safer option for military service. And yeah, evidence here that people are paying fines, and it's all, to be honest, completely unsurprising. A large-scale operation to deport migrants is underway in St. Petersburg. This is happening right across Russia, it seems. Within the framework of the operation, anti-migrant foreigners are massively detained and deported. Human rights activists report raids on hostels and apartments. Law enforcers on the road stop cars and check documents. Migrants are massively expelled from the country by airplanes from Pulkovo airport. Of course, this is in response to the terror attack on Crocus City Hall in the outskirts of Moscow recently. Zelensky's delivered a stark message to Congress as Russian missiles are pounding southern Ukraine. Give us the weapons to stop the Russian attacks. This is what it's saying. He's being much more explicit. Or Ukraine will escalate its counterattacks on Russia's airfields, energy facilities and other strategic targets, according to the Washington Post. I actually should have had that in the strikes section, really, to make more sense of that. This is... and it's part of that same article I was just quoting from, but this is another indication of how challenging things are in Ukraine right now with the Russian strikes. The Russians are having a successful time at striking Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and that is having an effect on morale. It's having an effect on Ukraine's ability to operate as a country. I keep talking about David Sachs because he's one of these big megaphones on Twitter that is completely anti-Ukraine. He's also Elon Musk's best mate, and then he just Elon Musk keeps regurgitating Sachs's claims. Anyway, Sachs was talking, I think, recently about the deterioration of artillery in Ukraine and woe is Ukraine, etc., which I'd argue isn't necessarily untrue, but he's saying it in a way of saying, well, they should give up, etc. Anyway, this is what a war translator is stating, or at least he's translating from a Russian source. Russian propagandists do not agree with military expert David Sachs in his assessment of the deteriorating artillery situation in Ukraine. So this is from a Russian source. We cannot speak for the entire front, but the soldiers with whom we are in contact do not see any catastrophic decline in the intensity of Ukrainian armed forces artillery in their sectors of the front. The collective howl is not without reason. So there are claims that actually the Ukrainians are using their artillery fairly effectively in certain places, but as mentioned there, you've always got to have the caveat that any opinion from the front line from either side is not going to be not necessarily going to be representative of what's going on along the whole front line. So that is merely anecdotal. Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated that the borders of Russia and Ukraine have changed. So if you have any doubt about what Russia are trying to do here and what they are intending, Peskov is saying that the borders have changed and everyone will have to reckon with the fact that the Russian Federation has 4 new regions. Deal with it. We've walked in and we've taken some more regions from Ukraine. Deal with it. That is a bully. It's just a bully, an international bully, a violent, genocidal bully. And we need to stand up to that. I don't think most people realise how nasty Russian messaging is and might think differently about the situation once they understand it's all either approved or directed by the Kremlin. And this is what I say about people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'd love them to sit down and listen to Russian propagandists and what they actually say, and then wonder whether they'll, challenge them on whether they're still so anti-Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Russia, state TV host Vladimir Solovyov insisted that Kharkiv should be erased off the face of the earth. Contrary to Putin's bold-faced lie about liberating Ukrainians, Solovyov admits that he feels absolutely no pity for anyone in Ukraine. This is what Russians think. this is what the Kremlin thinks because they sanction this kind of rhetoric. If you're the David Sacks of this world, you have no moral compass. You are broken. Right, now talking about... I just wanted to bring in this comment. Actually, do you know what? I'm going to leave that for the geopolitics video later because it falls in line with the stuff I'm going to say. Right, I'm going to leave you with this. So Russia is committing outrageous ecological crimes. Ukraine needs our help to stop them. So Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine's Kaniv and Dniester hydroelectric power plants were among the deliberate targets of Russians' mass air strikes this night. So this is a couple of nights ago. The terrorist state of Russia wishes to repeat the ecological disaster in the Kherson region following Russia's destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. This time, not only Ukraine, but also Moldova is at risk, or are at risk. Water will not stop at border posts, just as the Russian war will not stop unless it is stopped in time here in Ukraine. This was one of the topics discussed at today's staff meeting, which focused on the consequences of Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy system and the most effective ways to provide physical protection to energy facilities. We urge our partners to respond quickly and decisively to Russia's intensified bombing campaign against Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Ukraine urgently requires additional air defense systems and missiles. We need a strong and reliable air shield over Ukraine to protect people not only in our country but also in the rest of Europe and around the world from Russian terror. So ecological or ecocide is a real issue in Ukraine. There has been so much ecological damage to the country. It's an absolute, well, it's just another massive set of war crimes, right? But we shouldn't forget that, ecosystems are absolutely vital for the health of the country in general, but also, they add so much to your economy in so many ways. The agriculture as well connected to that, and just animals don't get a chance to fight back, so on and so forth. So. Yeah, I think we must remember the ecological impact of this war on Ukraine. And in fact, it has been totted up as a cost as well. So there was a report that came out recently that updated the cost. I forget what it is, but it's a phenomenal cost to the environment. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with this, with someone from Ukraine, the latest, who was on talking about the ecological effect of the war on Ukraine, and she ended with this poem, which I think is a brilliant way to end this piece.
Indulging, and it's a poem written by Katerina Michalitsina when she came to that site of a Russian strike in Lviv and saw those trees, and it rhymes really with what we have been discussing here, the question of justice and the question of witnessing by nature. And if you don't mind, I would read it now.
Please.
So the poem is called Witnesses of War Crimes. It's published in the London Ukrainian Review alongside another poem by Katerina about the Kakhovka Dam. And it goes like this. In this land, even trees bear witness. Please hug me gently, asks the ash tree on the side of the road. Now even gentleness hurts. Wounds ache for a long time like fallen nuts, green as July in which an abyss yawned, and you can't bridge it, whispers the walnut tree, stark naked. I am deaf, says the acacia. It stands on tiptoe, motionless, watching for swifts. It sees them but cannot hear. I have third-degree burns, moans the fir tree. The world around me breathes heat, like the fiery maw of the dragon that devours me. And I'm too unscathed among you. Why? Says the dogwood tree softly, drooping its leaves, inwardly withered by survivor's guilt. The dust swirls up. It shrouds the salt of their testimony in the billows of silence. Who will listen to these trees? Who will call them as witnesses in court?